Hello, and welcome back to the M.O.W channel. Today, we're going to dive into one of America's most infamous and shocking true crime cases, the BTK killer. Please remember to like and subscribe to the channel. Now, let's get started with today's story. It was the morning of January 15, 1974. Wichita, Kansas, a quintessential small city in the American Midwest, was enjoying the kind of peace and stability typical of mid-20th century America. Wichita was known as the Air Capital and a quiet community dominated by hard-working, conservative values. But that tranquility was shattered forever by a horrific crime at a single-story home on North Estes Street. Around 8 a.m., Charlie Otero, 16, returned home before school and discovered a terrifying scene. His entire family had been brutally murdered. The victims were the head of the household, Joseph Otero, 38, his wife Julie Otero, 34, and two of their children, Josephine, 11, and Joseph Jr., 9. 4 victims in total. The crime scene was so gruesome it shocked even the police. The victims were found in different rooms, all of them bound. They showed signs of forceful torture, and were ultimately killed. What baffled the police investigation team the most was the motive. There were no signs of a robbery for cash or valuables, and there was minimal evidence of forced entry. The killer had locked the door on the way out, suggesting a brazen, premeditated attack. Either the killer knew the victims or targeted a home with an unlocked door. The Otero murders immediately became the most vicious and mysterious case in Wichita police history, instantly spreading an unprecedented fear across the entire city. Police assembled a massive investigation team but found few concrete leads. The Oteros were a quiet, ordinary, middle-class family with no known major conflicts, making a crime of revenge seem unlikely. About 3 months after the investigation stalled, in October 1974, the case took a disturbing new turn when an anonymous letter was delivered to the Wichita Eagle newspaper. The sender claimed to be the Otero family killer. The letter contained gruesome details about the crime scene that the police had never publicly released, specific descriptions of the ropes used, the victims' precise injuries, and other insider information. It was then that the police realized the severity of the situation. This murder might be the beginning of a serial killer's spree. Even more shocking was the nickname the killer coined for himself in the letter, summarizing his method BTK. It stood for bind, torture, kill. This acronym was more than just a description. It revealed the killer's mindset that he viewed his crimes as a kind of identity or an act of perverse art. In his letters, BTK openly displayed a pathological sense of superiority, boasting that he was smarter than the police and in total control of the entire process. This chilling letter officially became a declaration of terror to the people of Wichita, a warning that an unknown evil was among them. BTK's reign of terror did not stop there. The second victim was actually killed before that first letter arrived. In April 1974, Catherine Bright, 21, was murdered in her apartment, and her brother was severely injured. This crime mirrored the Otero case. The victim was bound, tortured, and killed, and the killer had closed the apartment door behind him. BTK later sent a letter claiming credit for this second murder, confirming the police's suspicion that both incidents were the work of the same killer. BTK continued to terrorize the city, with more victims through 1977, escalating the fear. Shirley Bianca, 26, was murdered in her home in March 1977, and Nancy Fox, 25, was killed that December. During this period, BTK mocked the police and the public in his letters, famously asking, "Who's next?" Wichita citizens were afraid to leave their homes at night. They locked their doors and windows tight, and the police established a 24-hour special task force. Since people couldn't predict when, where, or whom BTK would strike, this terror seeped into everyone's daily lives. The investigation team analyzed the killer's letters and attempted to create a psychological profile. Initial profiling suggested that BTK was a white male, solitary, socially awkward, and harboring resentment toward women. However, the reason BTK was able to evade capture for so many years after his crimes, despite his brazenness and meticulous planning, was that his actual life was completely different from the profile's predictions. The killer intelligently played psychological games, either intentionally leaving no evidence or appearing to or subtly diverting police attention. The Otero family murders were not just a killing spree. They were the ominous start of a 30-year game of cat and mouse, where a serial killer established his identity, challenged the police, and held an entire city hostage to fear. BTK's brutal signature and bold communication style would become the defining symbols of an unsolved case for decades to come. After the BTK killer's initial brutal acts plunged Wichita into terror, the perpetrator slipped behind a mask of normalcy, seemingly mocking the authorities. His true identity was Dennis Lynn Rader, and for nearly 3 decades, He performed a perfect act on the stage of his deceptive double life. We need a deep dive into how a killer who claimed 4 lives in the mid-70s managed to exist within plain sight, and how his utter ordinariness frustrated every attempt by law enforcement to track him down. Rader's dual existence was not just a cover-up. It was a fundamental mechanism that sustained and satisfied his criminal psyche. Born in 1945, Dennis Lynn Rader was a Kansas native. After serving in the military, he married his wife, Paula, in 1971, and they had 2 children, a son and a daughter. His external life meticulously followed the normative ideal of Midwestern American society. He initially worked for a security system installation company, ADT. Then, in 1989, he moved to the Wichita suburb of Park City and took a job as a city compliance officer. This civil servant role gave him a legitimate measure of authority and a unique level of access to citizens' private property to inspect homes and grounds for compliance with city ordinances. This job may have been advantageous in 2 ways. It legally satisfied his need for control and gave him easy opportunities to scout potential victims or gather information for planning his crimes. Among residents, Rader was known as an overbearing, picky, and inflexible official. He was quick to issue warnings and fines for minor code violations, earning him the ire of some neighbors. However, this image of the petty tyrant paradoxically shielded him from suspicion. Who would ever imagine that a public servant enforcing the rules by day could be a monstrous serial killer by night? To solidify his dual existence, Rader was deeply involved in community activities. He was a devoted parishioner and a council president at Christ Lutheran Church in Park City. Within the church community, he was seen as a deeply faithful and dedicated husband and father, even participating in the Boy Scouts. This commitment to religion and civic duty stood in stark contrast to his horrific crimes, demonstrating the sheer extent to which he successfully compartmentalized and concealed his identity. His routine, his job, and his religious involvement all served as an impenetrable shield that kept suspicion at bay. Criminal psychologists suggest that serial killers like Rader often derive psychological satisfaction from maintaining such contrasting lives, performing a respectable, rule-abiding role publicly while secretly committing acts of utter depravity against societal norms was, for him, the ultimate exercise of control and power. His homicidal urges were completely isolated from his daily life, and he may have even relished the internal tension created by navigating these 2 worlds. While BTK committed murders intermittently between the late 1970s and 1991s, he completely disappeared for 13 years after his final victim, Dolores Davis, in 1991. The investigation team was baffled by this silence. The common assumptions were that the killer had died, been incarcerated for another crime, or moved to a different state. However, in Rader's case, this silence was a deliberate, strategic decision. He would voluntarily curb his impulses and retreat into the safety net of his normal life whenever he felt his existence was threatened or his criminal acts posed too great a risk. This proved that his crimes were not merely impulsive. They were highly planned and controlled. The 13-year dormancy demonstrated Rader's exceptional ability to manage and control every element of his daily environment: his family, his job, and his surroundings. He waited until he was certain he was no longer being pursued. During this time, his murderous urges were likely suppressed deep within and possibly used as an energy source to sustain his seemingly perfect, ordinary life. Rader's double life was the decisive factor that caused critical profiling errors for the investigative team. Profilers assumed the brutal BTK would be socially detached, unemployed, or struggling with relationships. Rader was the exact opposite: married, employed, and actively involved in his community. His name was quickly dismissed from the vast initial list of suspects. The BTK killer case is a chilling reminder that a serial killer doesn't have to be a societal outcast. Rader's perfect disguise was the most potent defense mechanism, fooling the Wichita police and frustrating the manhunt for 3 decades. For 13 years after his last murder in 1991, the BTK killer, Dennis Lynn Rader, was perfectly hidden behind the facade of his ordinary life. The terror in Wichita had faded, and while the dedicated BTK task force hadn't been dismantled, the case had settled deeply into the realm of a cold case. But in 2004, Rader committed a critical error. Unable to overcome his pathological narcissism and craving for control, he voluntarily resurfaced. This sudden re-emergence was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for the task force and an intense crisis, as they knew if they missed this chance, the killer might be gone forever. In March 2004, BTK sent a letter to the Wichita Eagle newspaper. The letter contained detailed information about the murder of Vicki Wegerle in April 1986. At the time, investigators hadn't definitively linked the case to BTK, but the unreleased details in the letter proved the killer was back. Rader had broken his 13-year silence, clearly seeking to reassert his legacy. Rader then began communicating directly with the police. He sent a series of letters, packages, and even boxes containing items he had left at past crime scenes. This was a psychological act by the killer, driven by an intense need to show off his intelligence and superiority. He was under the delusion that he was one step ahead of the police and could appear and disappear whenever he pleased. The police immediately reassembled the BTK task force, recognizing this communication as the sole opportunity to draw the killer out. The team began a psychological trap, communicating with BTK to gauge his psyche and lure him into revealing his own identity. The killer's communication became increasingly brazen and, critically, modernized. Late in 2004, Rader directly addressed the possibility of being traced through digital media. In a letter to the police, "If I use a floppy disk, can you guys trace me?" This question showed Rader was deeply concerned about maintaining his anonymity. An analog-era killer, he believed, he could now safely flaunt his crimes using digital technology. The police knew they couldn't miss this opening. After consulting with FBI experts, the task force executed a strategic deception. They published a newspaper ad, falsely assuring BTK that digital media like a floppy disk would be untraceable. This psychological ploy was designed to stroke BTK's ego and encourage him to use the very tool that would prove his undoing. Rader took the bait. Convinced that his intelligence surpassed police technology, he believed an anonymous floppy disk would never betray the identity he had protected for 13 years. In December 2004, Rader sent a 1.44 megabytes floppy disk containing his demands to the Kake TV station, which immediately handed it over to the police. The floppy disk was the single, most crucial piece of evidence that could potentially solve the 30-year-old cold case. The police faced extreme pressure during the analysis of this disk. If they made any mistakes, or if Rader realized his error and vanished again, the opportunity would be lost forever. The task force completely discarded standard investigative methods and brought in the FBI's top-tier digital forensics experts. The experts focused on analyzing the Microsoft Word document file contained on the disk. While the text itself was just BTK's narcissistic demands, the forensics team concentrated on extracting the hidden information embedded within the file, the metadata. Rader thought he had created the document anonymously, and that tracing it by conventional means was impossible. However, he overlooked the digital footprint that the document software automatically records. This metadata acted as a digital fingerprint, recording information like which computer the file was created on and which user account performed the final save. BTK's smart strategy, developed by an analog killer who had become overconfident in his understanding of digital technology, was now on the verge of collapsing against the emerging science of digital forensics. This chapter details the high-stakes process of the police handling this golden opportunity, and the critical moment when BTK's narcissism and technological ignorance led him directly into his own trap. The moment the floppy disk landed in the hands of the task force, the 30-year cold case lurched out of the abyss and rocketed toward a critical climax. This small piece of plastic was the BTK killer's final digital footprint, and the one chance for police to identify him. The joint forensics team from the FBI and local police handled the disk with extreme caution. A single mistake could alert the killer or compromise the evidence. This process became a symbolic moment in the history of modern criminal investigation, proving the power of digital forensics. The floppy disk Rader sent to the police contained a Microsoft Word document. The killer believed he had taken every precaution to write the content anonymously and avoid exposing his identity while handling the file. However, he overlooked the existence of the file's background data, the metadata, which is invisible to the average user. Metadata is the digital trail automatically recorded by the software, separate from the main text. It includes the file's creator, the last user who modified it, and the name or registered user information of the computer where it was saved. Forensic experts successfully delved into the Word file's internal structure and extracted this hidden fingerprint, which Rader had failed to intentionally erase. The information they extracted was the definitive clue that could instantly close the decades-long investigation. Username clue: the registered username of the computer that last modified the document was clearly recorded as Dennis. This single word immediately focused the task force's attention from a vast list of suspects down to individuals named Dennis. Computer location clue: the registration or location information for the computer where the file was saved pointed to Christ Lutheran Church. The combination of these two pieces of information was the final puzzle piece. The task force immediately began cross-referencing all individuals named Dennis in the Wichita and Park City areas who were affiliated with Christ Lutheran Church. Based on the metadata clues, the investigation team quickly zeroed in on one individual, Dennis Lynn Rader. Name match: his first name was Dennis. Occupation match: he worked as the Park City compliance officer, a job that afforded him the authority and access favorable to committing his crimes. Location match: he was the president of the church council at Christ Lutheran Church. Timeline match: his residency and job history perfectly aligned with the time frame and geographical locations of BTK's attacks. As all the circumstantial evidence pointed to one man, the police faced an unbelievable reality. The ruthless serial killer they had sought for 30 years was a seemingly ordinary, respected civil servant and church leader. To prevent Rader from realizing he had been compromised, fleeing, or destroying evidence, the police launched a top-secret surveillance operation. At this stage, they needed one thing: conclusive evidence: DNA. Obtaining a warrant for Rader's DNA sample was essential. However, a direct arrest warrant or forced DNA collection could alert Rader. Thus, the task force executed a highly discreet DNA retrieval strategy. The police secretly secured a court order for the Pap smear test slides submitted by Rader's adult daughter years earlier at a medical facility. Since his daughter's DNA was genetically linked to her father, Dennis Lynn Rader, it could serve as kinship evidence for comparison against the killer's DNA. The DNA profile generated from Rader's daughter ultimately confirmed a match with the semen samples that BTK had left at his early crime scenes 3 decades ago. This DNA analysis resolved all doubt, providing the decisive, scientific proof that Dennis Lynn Rader was the BTK killer. With the DNA evidence secured, the task force wasted no time. On February 25, 2005, Dennis Lynn Rader was intercepted by police as he drove his vehicle out for lunch near his Park City home. He remained unnervingly calm during the arrest, seemingly bewildered that he had finally been caught. His 3 decades of meticulous double life and intelligent concealment were ultimately shattered by a digital footprint left due to his overconfidence and the relentless pursuit of modern forensic science. The arrest was the dramatic climax that finally brought an end to Wichita's long nightmare. The news of Dennis Lynn Rader's arrest on February 25, 2005, sent shockwaves not just across Wichita, Kansas, but throughout the entire United States. The realization that the BTK killer, the source of 3 decades of unknown terror, was the same mundane civil servant who looked after children's friends and served in his church, severely fractured American society's sense of trust and security. This final chapter focuses on the aftermath: Rader's trial, the chilling psychology he revealed, and the permanent legacy the BTK case left on modern investigative technology and the legal system. Immediately following Rader's arrest, the people closest to him, his family, were plunged into the deepest despair. His wife, Paula, and their 2 children were utterly devastated to learn that the double life of the patriarch they loved and trusted was merely a mask for a brutal serial killer. Despite having no involvement in the crimes, the family had to confront the profound betrayal and public scorn. Paula immediately filed for an emergency divorce, and the family members were forced to hide their identities and flee to escape the relentless media scrutiny. The BTK case dramatically illustrated the tragic consequences of how one man's crimes could utterly destroy the lives of his entire family. The Park City municipal offices where Rader worked and the Lutheran church community where he served were also reeling. It was nearly impossible for them to reconcile the image of the code enforcement officer, or the man who reads scripture alongside them, with a cold-blooded murderer. The case exposed the terrifying depth of the evil hidden behind a human mask, sowing fundamental distrust among neighbors and communities. Rader's trial began in June 2005. Against the advice of his legal counsel, he pleaded guilty to all 10 counts of murder. The demeanor Rader displayed in court was as shocking as his heinous acts. He described the details of his crimes: the binding, the torture, and the killing of his victims calmly and dispassionately, as if delivering a routine work report. He used technical language to explain his process, showing absolutely no remorse or guilt for his actions. Psychologists and profilers pointed out that this chilling courtroom behavior was a manifestation of Rader's extreme narcissism and antisocial personality. He perceived his crimes not as simple murders, but as works or projects, and he used the courtroom confession as a final stage to flaunt his control and superiority. His cold testimony inflicted a second wave of emotional trauma on the victims' families. On August 18, 2005, Dennis Lynn Rader received his final sentence. Although Kansas had reinstated the death penalty by then, most of Rader's murders occurred during a period when capital punishment was suspended. As a result, he was spared the death penalty. Instead, he was sentenced to 10 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, meaning he would never be released from prison. The resolution of the BTK case is recorded as a major victory for modern investigative technology. The case left law enforcement agencies with several crucial lessons and legacies. The importance of digital forensics. BTK proved that minute digital traces, like metadata, can be powerful evidence. The understanding was established that even the most meticulous criminal cannot completely erase their digital footprint in the modern era. The power of DNA technology. Clues from decades-old cold cases. Semen samples were crucial in identifying the killer. Using advanced DNA technology and genetic association tracing through a family member's sample. Evolution of profiling raiders. Perfect double life shattered the traditional assumption that serial killers must be social misfits. Law enforcement agencies now account for the possibility of high-functioning serial killers, broadening the scope of profiling. Dennis Lynn Rader is currently incarcerated in the El Dorado Correctional Facility in Kansas. Even in prison, he continues to seek attention by writing about and drawing his crimes. The BTK case has concluded as one of the longest cold case manhunts in history. But the legacy of his deception and terror will forever remain in the memories of Wichita citizens and investigative experts, serving as a warning against hidden evil. The conclusion of this case ultimately sends a message of justice. No matter how cunning the criminal, they cannot hide from science and truth. That concludes today's story. Please be sure to like and subscribe. We'll return tomorrow with a new case and a new mystery. Thank you for watching.